My name is Matty, and at 65 years old, I thought I had learned everything there was to know about raising children. I had built a successful real estate business from the ground up, weathered the storm of losing my beloved husband Tom 8 years ago, and watched my daughter Sarah grow into what I believed was a capable, independent woman. Our Sunday dinners had become a cherished tradition, a time when Sarah and her husband Marcus would come over to my cozy two-story home, and we would share stories, laughter, and home-cooked meals. But 3 weeks ago, during what seemed like an ordinary evening, my daughter made a demand that would forever change our relationship. Before I share what happened that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real stories from life's unexpected moments. Now let me take you back to my kitchen, where everything began to unravel. I suppose I should start by telling you how I got to this point in my life. After Tom passed away from a sudden heart attack, I found myself alone in the house we had built together over 30 years. Sarah was 29, then already married to Marcus for 2 years, and I thought they were settled into their own life. The truth was, I had been perhaps too generous with them over the years, always ready to help when money got tight or when they needed a little extra support. My real estate career had been more successful than I ever dreamed possible. Starting as a small-town agent 40 years ago, I eventually built Riverside Properties into one of the most respected brokerages in our area. When I sold the company last year, the buyout was substantial enough to ensure a very comfortable retirement. I wasn't wealthy by celebrity standards, but I was financially secure in a way that many people my age could only dream of. Sarah had always been bright. She graduated from a prestigious university with a degree in communications, and I was so proud of her achievements. But looking back now, I realize that I may have shielded her from too many of life's financial realities. When she needed textbooks, I bought them. When she wanted to study abroad, I funded the trip. When she and Marcus needed help with their wedding, I covered most of the expenses without hesitation. Marcus seemed like a decent young man when they first started dating 3 years ago. He worked as a freelance marketing consultant, which meant his income fluctuated considerably from month to month. Sometimes he would land a big client, and they would celebrate with expensive dinners out. Other times he would go weeks without substantial work, and I noticed Sarah picking up more of their expenses during those lean periods. They lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from my house. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, safe, and affordable. Or at least it had been affordable until recently. Over the past few months, I had started noticing small changes in their conversations during our Sunday dinners. Marcus had begun making casual comments about how cramped their apartment felt, how the neighbors were too noisy, how the building's maintenance was lacking. Sarah would chime in with observations about other couples their age who were already homeowners, about how rent money was just money thrown away, about how they needed more space to think about starting a family someday. At first, these seemed like natural conversations that many young married couples have. Tom and I had rented for the first 5 years of our marriage before we saved enough for a down payment on our first little house. It was normal to outgrow your first place and dream of something bigger. But then I started noticing that these conversations always seemed to circle back to my financial situation in ways that made me slightly uncomfortable. Marcus would mention how lucky I was to have sold my business at just the right time before the market became more challenging. Sarah would talk about how smart I was with investments, how I had always made good financial decisions. There was something about the way they looked at each other during these exchanges that gave me a funny feeling in my stomach. It was as if they were having a conversation that I wasn't quite hearing, sending signals to each other that went right over my head. The first time I felt genuinely uneasy was during dinner 3 weeks before the incident that changed everything. Sarah and Marcus had arrived that Sunday evening with what seemed like unusual energy. They were more animated than usual, more talkative, and there was a kind of excitement in their voices that I couldn't quite identify. We were halfway through the pot roast when Sarah casually mentioned that they had spent their Saturday afternoon looking at houses in Maple Heights. Now, Maple Heights was the most expensive neighborhood in our entire county. The homes there started at around $600,000 and went up from there. Most of them were sprawling properties with perfectly manicured lawns, circular driveways, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of serious money. I nearly choked on my mashed potatoes. "You were looking at houses in Maple Heights?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level and curious rather than concerned. Marcus jumped in quickly, explaining that they were just getting a feel for the market and seeing what was out there. He said they wanted to understand the local real estate trends, since I had been in the business for so long and might find their observations interesting. But Sarah's face told a different story. There was a flush in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that I recognized from when she was a little girl and had been planning something she wasn't quite ready to reveal. She had that same look when she was 7 years old and had been secretly planning to ask for a puppy for Christmas. As the evening progressed, I noticed that they kept steering the conversation toward real estate values, property taxes, and investment potential. Marcus asked several detailed questions about the sale of my business questions that seemed surprisingly well informed for someone who claimed to be just curious. When they left that night, I found myself standing at my kitchen window, watching their car disappear down the street, with an uncomfortable knot forming in my chest. Something was happening. Something they weren't telling me. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever it was, it involved expectations of me that I might not be prepared to meet. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that our dinner conversation had been somehow orchestrated. The questions had been too specific, too focused, too prepared. It was as if they had practiced what they wanted to ask me. When Sarah called me later that week just to chat, I noticed that she asked even more questions about my finances. How was my retirement planning going? Was I happy with my investment advisor? Did I ever think about what I would do with the house when I got older and might need something smaller? These weren't entirely unreasonable questions for a daughter to ask her aging mother, but there was something about the timing and the way she asked them that made me increasingly uncomfortable. It felt less like concern for my well-being and more like reconnaissance. The following Sunday brought an even more unsettling dinner conversation. Sarah and Marcus arrived, with Marcus carrying a leather portfolio which he placed carefully beside his chair, as if it contained something important. Throughout dinner, I noticed him glancing at it periodically, and Sarah seemed more nervous than usual. They had clearly prepared for this conversation even more thoroughly than the previous week. Sarah began by talking about their 5-year plan and how they had been thinking seriously about their future together. She spoke about wanting to establish roots in the community, about the importance of building equity instead of paying rent, about how home ownership was a crucial step toward financial stability. Marcus nodded along, adding comments about market conditions and interest rates, with the kind of expertise that seemed suspiciously well-researched for someone whose background was in marketing, not real estate. He talked about how they had been running the numbers and had identified what he called a window of opportunity in the current market. Then Sarah dropped what I now realize was their first real test balloon. She mentioned that they had found a house that would be perfect for their needs in a neighborhood that offered excellent long-term value. The price tag, she said almost casually, was $750,000. I nearly dropped my fork. $750,000 was more than triple what Tom and I had paid for our house, even accounting for 30 years of inflation. It was an enormous sum for a young couple with inconsistent income and no substantial savings that I knew of. "That's quite a lot of money," I said carefully. Have you spoken to a mortgage broker about financing? The look that passed between them was unmistakable. They had definitely discussed this conversation in advance, and my question was clearly one they had anticipated. Marcus explained that they had done some preliminary research into financing options, but that the monthly payments would be challenging given the current interest rates and their employment situation. Sarah added that they would need help with the down payment to make the numbers work. Neither of them said the words directly, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. They were asking me to help them buy a house that cost $750,000. I tried to respond diplomatically, asking about their long-term financial projections and whether they had considered starting with something more modest. But as the conversation continued, I could see frustration building in Sarah's face. She began talking about how other couples their age had family support for major purchases, how important it was for families to help each other achieve their goals. Marcus became more direct, comparing my situation to that of other parents he knew who had helped their children with real estate investments. He used phrases like intergenerational wealth building and talked about how property ownership was becoming increasingly difficult for young people without family assistance. By the time they left that evening, I felt emotionally exhausted. I had managed to avoid making any commitments, but I could tell they were disappointed with my response. The atmosphere had shifted from warm and family-oriented to something that felt more like a business negotiation. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. My daughter and son-in-law had essentially asked me to fund a luxury home purchase, and when I hadn't immediately agreed, they had made me feel selfish and unsupportive. The final Sunday dinner before everything exploded was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my own home. Sarah and Marcus arrived, with Marcus carrying not just his leather portfolio, but also a laptop computer. They had clearly prepared what amounted to a formal presentation. After we finished eating, Marcus opened his laptop and began showing me what he called their investment proposal. He had created a detailed PowerPoint presentation, complete with comparative market analyses, property appreciation projections, and financing scenarios. It was the kind of professional presentation I might have expected to see in my real estate office, not in my dining room. The house they wanted was no longer the $750,000 property from the previous week. Now they had set their sights on a $990,000 home in the most exclusive section of Maple Heights. It was a sprawling four-bedroom colonial with a three-car garage, a swimming pool, and what Marcus described as significant entertainment space. As Marcus clicked through his slides explaining square footage and neighborhood demographics, Sarah watched my face intently. She had prepared her own part of the presentation, focusing on what she called the family investment angle. "Mum," she said, leaning forward across my dining room table, "you've worked so hard your entire life to build financial security. This is a chance for you to invest in our future, while also making a smart financial decision for yourself." They had calculated that if I provided the down payment and co-signed for the mortgage, the property would likely appreciate enough over 5 to 7 years to provide what Marcus called substantial returns on my investment. Sarah added that they would make the monthly mortgage payments and handle all the maintenance, so it would be essentially a hands-off investment for me. But as they continued their presentation, the numbers became increasingly unclear. When I asked specific questions about how they planned to afford monthly payments of over $4,000, plus property taxes and insurance, their answers became vague. Marcus mentioned growing his client base and expanding into new markets, but couldn't provide concrete projections. Sarah's responses were even more concerning. She talked about how I had more than enough to help them, how this was what family was supposed to do for each other, how I should want to see them succeed and build a good life together. When I gently suggested that $990,000 was an enormous amount of money, and perhaps they should consider something more modest to start with. Sarah's demeanor changed completely. Her voice became sharp and accusatory. She said I was being unnecessarily cautious and missing a great opportunity. She pointed out that I had sold my business for millions and was sitting on more money than I could ever spend in my lifetime. Marcus joined in his tone, becoming more aggressive than I had ever heard from him before. He said that I was in a position to change their entire life trajectory with what would be, for me, a relatively small financial commitment. When I continued to express hesitation, Sarah's frustration boiled over into anger. She raised her voice, something she had never done in my house before, and accused me of being selfish and unwilling to support my own family. "What are you saving that money for?" she demanded. "You're 65 years old. What could you possibly need it for that's more important than helping your daughter and son-in-law build a life together?" Marcus added fuel to the fire by suggesting that I was being controlling with my money and that my reluctance to help them was somehow a reflection of my lack of confidence in their relationship. The argument escalated until Sarah was shouting at me across my own dining room table, her face red with anger, saying things I never imagined I would hear from my own daughter. She called me selfish, impossible, and accused me of hoarding money while watching them struggle unnecessarily. I sat in stunned silence through most of this outburst. I had never seen this side of Sarah before, and I was genuinely shocked by the venom in her voice and the entitlement in her words. This was not the daughter I thought I had raised. When they finally stormed out of my house, slamming the front door behind them, I remained seated at my dining room table, surrounded by the remnants of what had been intended as a pleasant family dinner. The smell of the roast beef I had spent hours preparing still hung in the air, but the warmth and love that usually filled my home had been replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. That night I did not sleep at all. I sat in the armchair by my bedroom window, the same chair where I had spent so many sleepless nights after Tom died, and tried to process what had just happened in my home. The view from that window looked out over the garden Tom had planted in our backyard. Even in the darkness, I could make out the shapes of the rose bushes he had tended so carefully, the fruit trees we had planted together when Sarah was small, the little stone pathway he had laid by hand one summer weekend. As I sat there in the quiet darkness, memories began flooding back with painful clarity. I remembered Tom warning me years ago that I was perhaps being too generous with Sarah. He had worried that always solving her problems with money would prevent her from learning to solve them herself. When Sarah was in college and called home because she had spent her monthly allowance too quickly, Tom had suggested we let her figure out how to budget better. But I had always sent extra money instead. When she graduated and was looking for work, Tom thought we should encourage her to take whatever job she could find to gain experience. But I had supported her financially while she held out for the perfect position. Even after she married Marcus, I had continued the pattern. When their car broke down, I bought them a new one. When they wanted to take a vacation they couldn't afford, I funded it as an early anniversary gift. When Marcus's freelance work was slow, I would invite them over for dinner more often and send them home with groceries. Sitting there in the dark, I finally understood what Tom had tried to tell me all those years ago. I had not been helping Sarah. I had been enabling her. I had taught her that when she wanted something she couldn't afford, the solution was to come to me rather than to adjust her expectations or work harder to achieve her goals. The Sarah who had shouted at me in my dining room was not a different person from the daughter I thought I had raised. She was exactly the person I had raised. I had created someone who believed that my money was essentially her money, that my role as her mother was to fund her desires, and that my refusal to do so was a betrayal of my parental duties. As dawn broke over Tom's garden, I made my first decision. I would not give Sarah and Marcus money for a house, but I also would not cut them out of my life entirely. There had to be a middle path, a way to show love without enabling destructive behavior. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I called David Rodriguez, the attorney who had handled the sale of my business and who had been a friend for over 20 years. David was an early riser, and he answered on the second ring. "Matty, is everything all right? You sound upset." I told him everything that had happened, and David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Matty," he said finally, "I've seen this before. Adult children who view their parents' assets as their inheritance in waiting. It's more common than you might think, especially when parents have been financially generous over the years." We arranged to meet at his office that afternoon. David explained several options for protecting my assets, while still providing some support for Sarah, if I chose to do so. He suggested setting up a trust fund with specific conditions and limitations, something that would provide help for genuine needs, while preventing the kind of entitlement that had led to the previous night's confrontation. The more we talked, the more I realized that what I needed to give Sarah was not money, but boundaries. She needed to learn that love and financial support were not the same thing, and that I could care about her future without funding her every desire. By the time I left David's office, I had a plan. It was not what Sarah and Marcus wanted, but it was what I believed they needed. For the first time since the argument, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose, instead of just hurt and confusion. 3 days after our confrontation, I sent Sarah and Marcus an email. I chose email rather than a phone call, because I wanted to be able to express myself clearly without interruption, and because I wanted them to have time to process my words before responding. I began by acknowledging that I loved Sarah deeply and wanted her to be happy and successful in life. I explained that my refusal to buy them a house was not about lack of love or generosity, but about my belief that the best gift I could give them was the opportunity to build something through their own efforts. Then I outlined an alternative proposal. I offered to establish an educational fund that would pay for additional training certification or degree programs that would improve their earning potential. I also offered to provide a modest emergency fund that could be accessed for genuine medical emergencies or unexpected job loss, but only with proper documentation of the need. The conditions were clear and non-negotiable. Any educational funding would be paid directly to institutions, not to Sarah and Marcus. The emergency fund could only be accessed once per year and required verification that they had exhausted other options first. Most importantly, none of this money could be used for luxury purchases, real estate down payments, or lifestyle expenses. I explained that these conditions were not meant to be controlling, but were designed to provide genuine support while encouraging independence and responsibility. I told them I believed they were capable of building a good life together through their own efforts, and that I wanted to help them develop the skills and financial habits that would serve them well for the rest of their lives. The response was swift and furious. Sarah called me within 2 hours of receiving the email, and she was even angrier than she had been during our dinner confrontation. She accused me of trying to control their lives, of treating them like children, and of caring more about my money than about their happiness. Marcus sent me a series of text messages over the following days, each one more hostile than the last. He accused me of being manipulative and said that if I didn't change my decision, they would have no choice but to cut off contact with me entirely. Sarah enlisted several mutual friends to call me people from our church and neighborhood who had known our family for years. Some of these well-meaning friends suggested that I should be more flexible in my approach, that family harmony was more important than financial principles. But a few of these friends surprised me with their support. Linda Marshall, a woman I had known from church for over 15 years, told me about a similar experience she had had with her own son several years earlier. Matty, she said, the hardest thing I ever did was refuse to bail my son out of a bad financial decision. But it was also the best thing I ever did for him. He learned to be responsible with money because he had to, not because he wanted to. Linda's words gave me strength to stick to my decision. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and Marcus maintained complete silence. They didn't call, didn't visit, and didn't respond to my attempts to reach out to them. During this time, I threw myself into activities that brought me joy and purpose. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a women's shelter, and began taking long walks through my neighborhood. Instead of feeling lonely and guilty, I began to feel liberated. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around my own daughter, worried that saying the wrong thing might upset her or result in some kind of emotional punishment. I wasn't second-guessing every financial decision I made, wondering whether Sarah would approve or whether I should be spending my money differently. 2 months after our confrontation, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. The caller ID showed Sarah's name, and my heart jumped with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Hi, Mum." Her voice was quiet, subdued, completely different from the angry, demanding tone of our last conversation. "Hello, sweetheart. I've missed you." There was a long pause, and when Sarah spoke again, I could hear that she had been crying. "Mum, I owe you an apology, a really big apology." Over the next hour, Sarah told me about what had happened in the 2 months since our fight. Without the possibility of getting money from me, she and Marcus had been forced to face the reality of their financial situation. Marcus had finally committed to finding steady employment and had taken a full-time position with a local marketing firm. The salary was lower than what he could potentially earn freelancing, but it was reliable and came with benefits. Sarah had also made changes. She had gone back to school part-time to earn a certificate in digital marketing, using some money they had saved by giving up expensive dinners out and entertainment. She was paying for the classes herself with money she earned from a part-time job she had taken at a local nonprofit. Most importantly, they had found an affordable 2-bedroom house in a modest neighborhood with a monthly payment they could handle on their combined incomes. It wasn't the mansion in Maple Heights they had dreamed of, but it was theirs, earned through their own efforts. "Mum," Sarah said, "I've been thinking about that night when I yelled at you, and I'm so ashamed of the way I acted. I said terrible things to you, and I'm horrified that I ever thought I was entitled to your money just because I'm your daughter." She told me that she had talked to Linda Marshall at church, and that Linda had shared some of her own experiences with her children. Sarah said she was beginning to understand that my refusal to buy them a house had actually been an act of love, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. "I realize now that if you had just given us what we wanted, we never would have learned to work for it ourselves. We would have just kept expecting you to solve our problems with money, and that's not fair to you, and it's not healthy for us." Marcus got on the phone briefly to apologize as well. His tone was completely different from the hostile, entitled young man who had made demands in my dining room. He sounded humbled and genuinely remorseful. 3 weeks later, Sarah and Marcus came over for Sunday dinner. It was the first time they had been in my house since the night of our argument, and we were all nervous about how it would go. But something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Instead of Sarah and Marcus treating me like a source of funding for their dreams, they talked to me like an equal, sharing their struggles and successes with genuine humility and appreciation for any advice I might offer. They showed me pictures of their new house, excited about the improvements they were making with their own hands and money they had saved. Marcus talked about his new job with enthusiasm, proud of the stability and growth opportunities it offered. Sarah described her classes and how much she was enjoying learning new skills that would advance her career. Most importantly, There were clear boundaries in place that made our relationship healthier and more respectful. They didn't ask me for money, and I didn't offer it unless they faced a genuine emergency. Our conversation were about our lives and relationships, not about financial transactions. When they left that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in our relationship for years. I felt proud of them, not because of what they owned or what I had given them, but because of what they had accomplished through their own efforts and determination. As I cleaned up the dinner dishes, I realized that saying no to Sarah's demand had been the most loving thing I could have done for her. By refusing to enable her entitlement, I had forced her to discover her own strength and capability. I thought about Tom and how he would have been proud of the way things had worked out. He had always believed that the greatest gift we could give our children was not money or possessions, but the confidence that comes from achieving things through their own efforts. Looking back now, I understand that the painful confrontation in my dining room was not the end of my relationship with my daughter, but the beginning of a healthier, more respectful relationship, based on mutual appreciation rather than financial dependency. Love doesn't mean giving someone everything they want. Sometimes love means helping them become the person they need to be, even when that process is difficult and painful for everyone involved. There are evenings now when I sit in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Sarah once shouted at me about a house she couldn't afford, and I feel a deep sense of peace. Not because the conflict was easy, or because I enjoyed watching my daughter struggle, but because I know that she is now building a life based on her own strength, rather than my wallet. The greatest gift a parent can give a child is not financial security, but the skills and character needed to create their own security. And sometimes the most loving word we can say is simply quietly and firmly no. In the silence of my evening reflections, I have finally found my own voice, separate from my role as provider and enabler. And in learning to respect my own boundaries, I have taught my daughter to respect them too. What about you? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with someone you love, even when it meant short-term pain, for long-term healing? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family relationships and the courage it takes to love people in healthy ways. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the hardest decisions we make are also the most loving ones. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people you love.